Good afternoon and welcome to Travel Talk Live. My name is Rob Stewart and I will be your moderator this afternoon. And Nancy McDonald will handle your questions at the end of the presentation. Our speaker today is Master Gardener Catherine Disley, who will deliver her talk on Container Cultivation 201, how to keep your containers thriving all season. This will cover fertilizing, deadheading, and rejuvenation. Catherine is a graduate of Algonquin College Horticulture and Landscape Program and has been a Master Gardener of Ottawa-Carleton for over 12 years. She has created, maintained, and sold hundreds of containers and hanging baskets in her working life and will provide some tips today on how to keep them thriving throughout the remainder of the growing season. If you have any questions during the talk, please enter your questions using the chat feature. Your questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Those that we are unable to answer because of time can be submitted to the Master Gardeners email helpline. I will now turn you over to Catherine.
Thank you, Rob. Welcome to Container Gardening 201. In my previous talk, Container Gardening 101, I mentioned that if you provide the basics to the plants at the start of the season, your plants should be flourishing now. So I'm going to review a few of the slides that were in that so that you might find that some of the things that I'm talking about may be reasons why your containers may not be doing so well right now. And the first one is pot size. The bigger the pot, the better. The large volume of soil promotes a larger root structure, which means more flowers or more fruit on them, whatever it is you're trying to grow. The larger root system and the more soil also retains moisture for a longer period of time. So you won't have to water quite as often. Doesn't mean to say you can't use small pots, just choose your plants accordingly. If it's a small pot, choose drought tolerant plants that don't mind getting very dry. Or if you're growing edibles, choose things like greens, lettuce, herbs that don't mind having a small pot. I also talked about it's wise at the beginning to transplant your hanging basket into a larger container. Often when you buy your plants in the beginning of the season, especially if it's a hanging basket, you can see in this photo, there's already a significant amount of roots there. And if you think that that hanging basket is going to be happy growing in the pot that it came in all season long, you may find that it takes a lot of work to keep it watered and be properly fed. So we did discuss how to transplant it easily. I also talk about the significance of good quality growing medium and the poorer quality mediums that are on the market. The main difference is the amount of vermiculite or perlite, the white ingredients that you see in these photos. In the bargain photo that you see, there's hardly any, even though it says it's on the label, there's hardly any when you look at it. And what the perlite or vermiculite does is create air spaces in the soil. And just like plants need water, they also need air. So the roots need air. So how often do you water is a good question, and you may struggle with that, but it depends on the temperatures. It depends on the amount of sun that we're getting. If we're having an extended cloudy period, your plants are not needing as much water. It depends if the plants are in a very windy location. If you're balcony gardening, often wind is a significant factor and your plants dry out very quickly. As mentioned before, the pot size is a big factor. Remember, the bigger is better. And the size of the plant. Now that your plants have grown significantly from the start of the season, they're going to be requiring more moisture than they did as small plants. So it's important to ensure that you water your containers and they become thoroughly saturated when you do so. The photo is showing a container, a hanging basket that I had been delivered at least two 5-liter gallons or 5-liter watering cans of water to this pot. I felt it, lifted it up. It felt very heavy. I was quite sure that it had received a significant drink and it would be thoroughly wet. However, when I took it out of its container so that I could put it in a larger pot, I could see that the entire middle section did not receive any water. What happens when this soilless mix gets to the very dry stage is it kind of repels water, and it's very difficult for it to reabsorb. So it's best if you can take your hanging baskets and soak them in a tub of water so that they wick the water up like a sponge. Or if you can't put it in a tub, if it's a big pot, ensure that you're taking the time to pour that water on slowly. And it may take 2 or 3 watering cans. It may take a couple of hours for this to actually take place, but check the soil to make sure that you have given them a good drink, that the water is penetrated 2 or 3 inches down. Because if this plant was left, it would be wilting the next day, and we would just be repeating that process. So just remember that these containers do take time to absorb the water. So you want to check them daily, and you want to do this with your finger. So don't just tap the top of the soil with your finger. You have to stick your finger in, preferably up until maybe your second knuckle, so that you get an idea of what's happening deeper within the pot. The soil on the top of the pot is always going to be dry out first, because that's where the evaporation takes place. But just because the soil at the very surface is dry doesn't mean that halfway through the pot or down at the bottom where the majority of roots are, that area of the pot evaporates at a slower rate. So determine for sure that your plant does need water. Do not wait, ideally, until they are at the wilting point. This plant was caught, I think, just in the nick of time. If it had gone another day or so, it would not have responded as is shown in the second picture, where it did perk up and is fine after that. So here's another image of some lobelia that was wilting, and the owner gave it a good drink of water, and in a few hours it bounced right back and was beautiful. So that's great. Here's another lobelia of the same owner that was also wilted at the same time, but it didn't bounce back. So what you need to know is that do not assume that a wilting plant needs water. An overwatered plant also wilts. So you want to make sure first to try and determine, well, why is this plant wilting? Why is it, constantly moist? And in the case of this lobelia here, there obviously was some kind of malfunction, I guess, at the pot manufacturing plant, because this pot did not have any drainage holes. And you would, of course, expect it to, because 99% of them do. So once she realized that the pot was not draining at all, she, of course, corrected that. But even if your pot has drainage holes, sometimes people will just oversaturate their plants on a daily basis, or they're left out in a rain. Maybe they're getting filled up with water from, a really huge downpour. So check, investigate why that's happening. And remember too, that heat stressed plants will also wilt. So if you have a plant and it's a very hot day, usually it happens in the middle of the day, feel the soil. If the soil is still wet, do not water the plant. This is a reaction that the plants do. They're not able to absorb the water fast enough that it's being transpired. So it's just a mechanism. And at the end of the day, they typically bounce back again. So some maintenance that you need to do. Hopefully your plants are growing really well, and you may need to prune them out to keep them in proportion with the other plants in the container. So where these arrows are pointing, you would cut that right out. You can root those then and give them away. But by pruning plants at various stages throughout the growing season, you're also encouraging the plant to be putting out branches and being nice and bushy for you. The other thing you can do is remove plants that are not performing well. This particular celosia was being just sitting there. It really wasn't growing or doing anything. And the other plants around it were doing quite nicely and were shading it out. So there was no way that it was ever going to pick it up and compete with those. So what I did was just dig it out, fill the space where it was lifted out with soil, and the other plants in there will go ahead and fill in and fix that problem. So how do you get blooms all season? This is what we want, whether it's blooms or it's fruit on our tomato plants or pepper plants. And one of the main things is fertilizer. So you can use organic fertilizers or synthetics. The choice is yours. Your plants do not know the difference between an organic or a synthetic fertilizer. So at planting time, you would add slow release fertilizer that's given off every time you water throughout the season. If you've purchased containers, they usually do have slow release fertilizer added in. But by the time, we've gone on 4 to 6 weeks, that fertilizer has started to be depleted. And now is the time that you would start supplementing that with water soluble fertilizers. And when you're growing in this soilless mix, it's advisable if you use a fertilizer that contains micronutrients. In the soil in your garden, there will be micronutrients naturally in it, but the soilless mix does not have any. So the water soluble fertilizers are fast acting. So, when you water them, you're not going to have to wait a few weeks. Probably in a week or so, that fertilizer is starting to work its way through the plant. So always read your labels and follow the directions as for how often and the ratios to mix it. So preparing for this talk and also for my own knowledge all along, I've often wondered, well, what kind of fertilizer is best to use? And what I've been reading lately is that a ratio of 3:1 meets most plants' needs, and that specialized fertilizers that promote flowers or roots are not substantiated by research. So what this means is the photo here that's showing the product that says Ultra Bloom, and it has the high middle number, which is supposed to be encouraging flowers. Well, actually, there's no research to support that. And this is what fertilizer manufacturers do to make us buy more products. So I do have some links at the end of my talk that if you're interested in reading some more on that, you'll find information there. So to keep your plants happy and flowering, you want to remove the spent blooms. So you want to cut off the blooms, not just pull them off or allow them to fall off. This is showing a petunia. And if you just remove the spent flower, it's still leaving the pod where the seeds form. And you want to prevent the seeds from forming, because when seeds start forming, the plant kicks into seed manufacturing mode and not flower production mode. You can also remove the spent blooms to improve the appearance. So here's a begonia, and they continue to produce their flowers in a long chain. And after a while, they tend to look a little bit scraggly. So just go right in and remove the whole spent chain there. And in a few days, you're going to start getting flowers appearing more where the foliage is, and it'll look much better for you. So here's a basket that it's time for a trim. So if you do this on a regular basis throughout the summer, maybe you take off a quarter to a third of the foliage the foliage and the flowers all season long, you don't end up with having to do it all at once, which can look a little bit drastic. But even if you haven't done it all along, you will reap the benefits if you do give it a good trim. So here's some examples. Again, petunias, they're growing in this long chain, and they're not necessarily, they're just going to continue that long chain. So if you go back closer to where the plant starts, you're going to get it branching out there. Where it's cut, you will probably get 2 or 3 branches forming, and on those branches, you get the more flowers coming. Here is lobelia. And if you tried removing each one of those little tiny lobelia spent blooms, it would be very time consuming and tedious. So if you just go in and cut them deep into the plant, they're going to branch out there and start with some new flowers. I find that lobelia is much like pansies that come the real hot days of the midsummer, they stop blooming, but by pinching them or trimming them like this, it does encourage them to put out growth and provide more blooms for you. So here's an example of regenerative pruning. So this plant was not given a trim, throughout the season on a regular basis, and we develop long spindly leaves or spindly branches with no leaves on them. So again, go in, find where you see some leaves starting near the base of the plant, cut that right off, and those little tiny leaves are going to start new branches and new flowers on them. I'm going to discuss tomatoes in pots because that's one of the most common things that people grow and that people have troubles with. So it's important that if you want an easier way to go about growing tomatoes, you choose determinate varieties. And that means that the plants grow to a certain height, and then they stop at that. And there are many that are suited to growing in containers. And they will say that right on the seed package or the label. So look for that and provide as big a pot as possible. The tomato here, Gold Nugget, it says on the label that it's suitable for 5-gallon containers. And I do have one growing in a smaller container, but this is also a Gold Nugget that you're seeing in this pot. This pot is probably a 20-gallon container, and already my Gold Nugget plant is, don't know that it knows that it's a determinate plant. It's reaching up probably 7 or 8 feet now. Anyway, you want your watering to be consistent. Tomatoes do not want to dry out and wilt. When they do, this is often leads to blossom end rot, which is the scabby thing on the bottom of the pot, of the bottom of the tomato, actually. So be consistent with your watering. Applying some mulch on top of your soil will help conserve the moisture in the pot. It'll help keep the soil cool, which again, tomatoes don't like it if their pot is really hot, and that's with small pots, they heat up much more quickly. But with your tomatoes, fertilize, because they do need food, but do it cautiously. Probably a ratio, look for a plant food ratio of 5-10-10. Avoid excessive nitrogen. When you have a fertilizer that's giving more nitrogen than the tomato plant wants, you're getting more foliage instead of flowers, and then of course the fruit. And excessive nitrogen can also lead to some other issues. Oops, wrong way. So critters at the beginning of the season can be prevented digging in your pots, which is what usually happens at the beginning with these animal repellent mats. But now what happens is you'll often find that these critters, and especially squirrels, are going for your flowers or your fruit. So by providing them with water that they can access, people have found that they're going for their fruit, they think, because they're thirsty. So give them some water, or if you're still having issues, try excluding them from accessing your tomatoes or peppers or whatever it is. And here you can tie on some of the containers that you're buying your fruits and vegetables with at the store. There's the clamshell type or the bags that have fruit sold in them, and they've got ventilation in them, but that should be enough to discourage them from being eaten. If you get any insects, please identify if they are actually beneficial insects on your plants, or if they are a pest. You need to learn the effective controls for each insect before you start taking any action. Here I have quite a good amount of black aphids on this dahlia. And all I needed to do was take a moist paper towel and wipe them off. And it's been 10, 12 days and the aphids have not returned. So you can do that on a plant that has nice sturdy stems that you can easily wipe down. But sometimes you'll have a plant that is very bushy and there's just no way that you can wipe them. But all you need to do with aphids is take a strong spray of water and blast them off. You may have to do it for a couple of days in a row, but you shouldn't have to use any kind of soaps or chemicals or anything to get rid of aphids, and allow time for the beneficial insects and birds to move in, because aphids are what helps keep those creatures going. So here we're getting towards the end, and here is, this page will be up for a while, and you can see the sites that I was referring to on my fertilizer slide, which fertilizer is best, compare different fertilizers. That's from Garden Fundamentals, and that's a YouTube video, really worth watching. Another one, plant starters and root boosters, do they work? And then more on tomato growing. There's more than I can cover in this talk. So here is a good link. What is the best way to grow tomatoes in a container, from the University of New Hampshire's Cooperative Extension. And so now I'm happy to answer any questions that we might have.
Okay, thank you so much, Catherine. I'm going to go out and maybe do some trimming after talking to you. So the first question from Eva is, do you have any good herb combos I can plant in containers?
Well, I've often grown cilantro in containers. And of course, mint is good to keep in a container, because if you put mint in your garden, it will quickly overtake your garden. But I think just about any herb is possible to put in containers. Thyme, marjoram, whatever you want to be eating, put it in a container. Try to choose the biggest container that you can find. There's, especially if you're growing mint, it is going to need a larger container than the smaller ones. Parsley is wonderful. Basil is wonderful in containers. So lots of options. Just experiment. You'll never, find out what you like to eat, put them in a container, and away you go. A lot of the herbs do not want high nitrogen though. So do some research as to what you're trying to grow, and don't necessarily overfeed your herbs.
Okay, on a Spanish lavender tree, it's 2 feet tall now, asking, will it survive indoors in the winter?
That's a good question. It certainly won't survive outdoors. So it's going to depend on the conditions of your house as to whether you can provide the bright light that it needs. So all I can say is give it as bright a spot as possible. Before you bring it in the house, you may want to, give it a good hose off in case it's bringing in any spider mites or aphids. Lavender doesn't typically get a lot of insects on it, so that shouldn't be a concern, but always wash your plants off well, and set the pot in some water. I would say set it in a tub of water in case you've got any creepy crawlies that are in the earth, that when you submerge that pot underwater, those insects will, not want to drown, so they'll leave the pot. But give it a try. Let us know how it works.
Okay, and another question, how far back do you trim a Rex begonia? To the base or just remove the leaves, which is yellowed?
Yeah, so often Rex, well, it depends on what we're exactly talking about, Rex begonias, but Rex begonias are typically an indoor plant, although they do very nicely in, not too sunny spot outside, but typically just removing the leaf itself and the whole stem that the leaf is attached to is what I would do. Now, if at some point you've had this plant for a period of time and you're getting very bare stems, you can cut that right off and it should branch out where it was cut. And then you should be able to root the section that came off. And those begonias also can be rooted by the leaves. You would lay the leaf on top of the soil and weight that down. You should be able to find instructions on how to root by layering the leaves on the internet.
Okay. Someone is asking if we can put the resources in the chat, easier to copy. I'm not sure. I mean, they could take a screenshot, I guess, of that slide, but not sure if.
Sure, or if they just jot down the name, the title, and do a Google search, that's going to come up.
Okay.
Or I don't know how else we can do it. We could have it, if they send it through the email helpline, we can get it that way. Unless somebody can copy it and get it into the chat now. I'm sorry, I didn't think to do that.
Another question, do you ever use compost in the container soil at the time of planting?
Yes, I'm glad somebody asked that. For sure, it's advisable, and it's very advisable if you're growing tomato plants. Mm-hmm. Compost is a slow release fertilizer. The problem is that it can really, it releases over a period of years. So you can't necessarily rely solely on the compost providing the nutrients, but what the compost does when it's combined with the soilless mix, whether you're growing an edible or you're growing flowers, is it helps the soil retain moisture. So I often, or always actually, I make my own compost. So I mix that in, maybe 25%, or if it's a tomato plant, I'll even put it maybe up to 50% compost with the soilless mix. And I've got very good results that way.
And do you reuse the same soil from year to year, or do you empty all your containers and start with fresh soil in the spring?
If I'm growing flowers, I would reuse the soil, no problem. You wouldn't reuse the soil if you were growing, say, tomatoes that developed a disease, which often tomatoes do get that. And these are often soil-borne diseases, so you don't want to reuse the soil in that case. But if you're growing something and there's been no signs of disease, you don't need to dispose of it. Reuse it, and that's where the compost helps to replenish it, or just top it up with some fresh soil if it's sunk. Often, these ingredients do sort of compact over time. But yeah, definitely reuse it. It's a valuable resource.
We have time for one more question.
A question, if you want to bring your herbs back in the fall, what do you need to get rid of bugs to bring them in? Probably what you were mentioning, Catherine.
Yeah, so set the pots in a tub of water so that they're submerged, so that any insects that might be in those pots in the soil are going to leave. Earwigs could easily be hiding in there, slugs, that sort of thing. You want to get rid of them from soaking the pots in water. Hosing off the plants. It doesn't hurt, obviously, to use as a precautionary measure, just spraying them with I said a brand name, insecticidal soap. Any brand of insecticidal soap sprayed on. And when you do bring your plants inside, If you have other plants, it's always good to isolate the ones that you're bringing in. Either put them in a separate room, or if you suspect that there might be some insects on there, you can put them in a clear bag, like a dry cleaner bag or something, so that if the insects are on there, you're keeping them contained in their own little environment, and you can either decide to dispose of the plant and not deal with the insects any further, or continue to treat them. I've often found that enclosing a plant that has spider mites really does help eliminate the spider mites, because spider mites don't like a humid environment. They like your dry air that develops in the fall and winter in your home. So, plastic bag really does wonders for them.
Hey, I
That's
know
all the
that,
time. Sorry, that's all the time we have for our Toronto Talk Live today. I want to thank Catherine for a wonderful presentation, and I trust our audience saw lots of good tips that they can use to help grow their containers through the rest of the season. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.